You're listening to The Alchemist's Ring, audiobook performed by author Jason Lee Willis. Part 6, The Ghosts of Oak Island. Chapter 92, London, England, 1709. Michael Sakar double-checked the address and then walked around to the front of the building. The grand four-story home seemed appropriate for one of the world's most powerful men who wished to hide in plain sight. Even the address seemed duplicitous, for there were two street addresses. The front of the house was facing posh St. Martin Street, the political facade for Sir Isaac Newton. The back door, to which the directions led him, was Ormond Square, a courtyard with a single elm tree. Sakar slipped the piece of paper into one of his pockets, not already stuffed with mechanisms of death. He ran a hand through his thinning hair and opened the metal gate separating the home from the cobblestone street. Potted geraniums grew on both sides of the entryway. He knocked firmly. When the door opened, a single female servant stood and blocked his entrance. "Hello, I am Michael Sakar. I have an appointment with Sir Newton." "Please excuse me for one moment," she said, closing the door. "Enter through the front door and all is well. Enter through the back door unseen, and you could leave in little bits and pieces in the trash." When it opened again, a beautiful young woman stood at the bottom of the stairs behind the maid. "Mr. Sakar, please come in," she said, her brow wrinkled as she studied him curiously. "She's in the Priory, too. How times are changing. Miss Barton, you are even more lovely than the rumors suggest." She giggled and rolled her eyes. "Come, my uncle is upstairs." He handed the maid his jacket, fully aware she'd find the weapons once he walked up the stairs. Newton knows what kind of creature I am. As he was reaching the top of the stairs, another figure came up the stairs from the rear of the house, the hunchback. Bernard Clerval could not hide his agitation. The twisted mass of sinew and muscle had undoubtedly been powerful in his youth, and from his reputation, quite cunning. Could I take him in a struggle? How does one earn his way into being Newton's right-hand man? As a professional assassin, Sakar kept himself fit and strong for times when poisons, powders, and blades failed. Powerful men expect absolute obedience, including when to arrive for a meeting and which door to enter. But I've sworn no oaths to him, only the Priory. Good to meet you in person, Mr. Sakar. We eagerly await your personal report, however enigmatic." Clerval turned and began his ascent up the stairs, working twice as hard as an average man. As if noticing this, Miss Barton walked beside him, attempting to small talk as they followed slowly. Finally, they stopped at a large library with more art than artifacts. A lie to remind his other guests that he is a politician and not an alchemist. "I wonder where your secret lab is hidden." Isaac Newton sat on a couch with a blanket under his legs. He wore a yellow robe with a blue silk collar and a basic white shirt underneath. His hair was fine silver with enough length to cover his balding scalp and brow. His pale complexion was reddish around his angular nose and cheek, making him seem jovial despite his emotionless stare. "Bernard tells me your investigation has taken a sudden turn. Please, have a seat." Barton, leaning back into the corner of the red sofa, sat atop the edges of the blanket next to her uncle. Bernard Clerval poured from an open bottle of wine and offered the first cup to Newton, a second to Barton, and then lifted the last two and carried both to where Sakar sat. "He's letting me choose. Proof of no poison. These bastards could have developed a tolerance or have an antidote. C'est la vie." He accepted the cup. "To what shall we drink?" Newton asked genteelly. "Hang all the pirates," Barton said with a flash of dimples. "Child," Newton chided. "Death will have his day," Barton countered. "Shakespeare," Newton smiled and raised his cup higher. "Death will have his day." Sakar repeated, swallowed, and began. Adrian Van Brock, the assumed pseudonym for the author of the life and adventures of Captain John Avery, is the name of a real Dutch captain. He worked for the Dutch East India Company for the past 19 years, primarily on a route between Bombay and a cinnamon plantation on the island of Sri Lanka, until a few years ago, late 1705, when an earthquake off of Madagascar claimed his ship and crew. Madagascar? Newton muttered. Yes, small world. I want to apologize, for I understand my mandate was to investigate the veracity of the text. The colony Libertalia is a fiction. The pirate utopia described in the book, replete with a naval armada, a 15,000-man army, and an impregnable fortress, also does not match reality. Yes, there were settlements and colonies on the island continent, but the author made obvious changes. The most dramatic change involved the events of the Ganges Swai. Instead of the brutal rape of the emperor's daughter, Henry Avery fell in love with her, preserved her honor, and ran off to Madagascar with her, where he created a royal family in a fantasy kingdom. While the text is a fabrication, ask yourself who it serves. Obviously, Henry Avery, Newton said. That was my first reaction also, for the yarn tries to rehabilitate his ruined name. But hidden under the lies is a strange truth, a princess of Madagascar. In truth, there is a Queen Rehena, who once was a princess, whose royal son and heir, Ratsimilahu, is of course mixed blood. Rumors say he is the son of a pirate. But not Avery? He's quite keen. No, I believe the real author of the text might be the father, or perhaps even her lover. Adrian Van Brock, the Dutch captain? But he's dead, you claimed. Rumors claim it, not I, but no, I do not think the prince's father is Dutch. I believe his father is French, a pirate known as Gareth Legrand. Not Thomas Tew? Newton asked. An obvious pseudonym. So who is this pirate? When you squeeze an orange to extract its juice, whether it is a light squeezing or enough to get every last drop, the orange cannot be restored. Left alone, the orange might have continued as it was for weeks, but even with the slightest squeezing, it quickly rots. In my profession, I've learned to simply get all I can and then toss the rind and pulp away. This is how I deal with people on my list. I extract all I can and then leave them in the ground. Despite Barton's obvious annoyance, Newton sat up straighter to listen. I've recently squeezed an orange to extract juice. After 16 years of relative silence, the name Avery emerged in a tell-all new book. So, after a few months of investigation into Madagascar and Van Brock, I stopped looking for the author and instead searched for the acquisition agent, whom I found in Amsterdam. Newton nodded his head in anticipation. After a little squeezing, I learned that the complete manuscript was brought to Amsterdam by a Dutch captain who was seeking a new life in America, his pockets lined with gold. He only fulfilled his end of a bargain by dropping off a manuscript he didn't write. So you killed an innocent man? Barton asked dismissively. This French agent has several publications to credit, so I won't bore you with those details except to highlight his most successful manuscript, New Voyages to North America, Volumes 1 and 2. Newton said it aloud for the others. Baron Lahontan. Our fugitive fur trader has stuck his head up for air, and instead of fanciful tales of the Long River and exotic tribes that live in a land where the earth bleeds blue, he writes a love story about a Madagascar princess. Obviously, just the origin of the two texts was enough to convince me, but upon examining them, both the hyperbolic distortions of truth, I understand now why the Baron has so easily evaded capture by King Louis's bounty hunters. Newton hummed. Bernard Clairval took longer to understand. Baron Lahoughton wrote a book about the life of Henry Avery? How would he even know him? The French king drove him underground, Barton assessed. And where's a better place to evade justice than on a pirate ship? The text isn't the story of Avery. It's Lahoughton's tale. Remind me about his African queen? Rahena? She recently won a war in her country against southern tribes who were poised to invade the lush eastern region. Just prior to the outbreak of war, she entertained a pirate known as Red-Eye, or Gareth Legrand. Gareth Legrand? Clairval repeated. Isn't that the name of the fellow wanted by Emperor Aurangzeb and the East India Trading Company? Newton did not respond. He only blinked. Obviously, I've given them valuable information. I wonder what connection Baron Lahoughton had with India. Should I know this Baron Lahoughton? Barton asked. Clairval explained. He is a minor French nobleman who came to New France in the 1680s as an adventurer, or so it was thought. All the known powers clashed and spied, while this brash young man went right to the heart of the matter and set the frontier on fire. 2 decades later, things are just beginning to calm again. The heart of the matter? Barton repeated, to which Clairval nodded. So after leaving the frontier, he went all the way to Madagascar too? Enough! Newton snapped, causing everyone to jump. His glare shut all mouths, and then in a heartbeat, he put on a smile. My apologies, Catherine, and to you also, Bernard. I focused all of my attention upon Eos, and I failed to factor in another variable in the equation, the periphery. The periphery, Clairval repeated. We had the solution to this problem. And we let it slip right through our fingers, Newton said, and then he buried his head in his hands. The other two held their tongues. Our collateral. At this, the hunchback gasped. The prince. Barton's eyes grew wide. He was just released and sent back to his mother. Queen Rahena sided against Eos, but secretly dealt with a periphery agent, Newton muttered, with his head still hidden. His hands dropped to pleasantly add, from his time on the frontier as Baron Lahoughton, to his time as pirate as Gareth Legrand, it is clear this periphery agent has been 2 steps ahead of me. Sicard watched as Barton and Clairval tried to catch up. Lahoughton's tampering on the frontier created a roadblock to both Eos and the Priory. And then he quickly returned to keep England from dislodging the French in Quebec and Montreal. A few years later, as Newton prepared to crush Eos in Madagascar, an anonymous pirate meddled once again, creating another stalemate. An impressive fellow, whoever he is. Newton turned to him. Mr. Sicard, your efforts in this matter will be well rewarded, and I wish to enlist your efforts again. When Baron Lahoughton makes port again, I want you to be there to eliminate him. Is that clear? A challenge worthy of my talents. Chapter 93. Natchez, Louisiana, 1710. Gaspar looked out over the Mississippi River Valley, now a mixture of blood and ice. He cleaned the blood from his hatchet by chopping into the edge of the frozen river, leaving behind French blood while also creating a gap in the ice. He set the hatchet aside and splashed cold water onto his face. The muskrat has emerged to strike his enemy. Unlike in his youth, Gaspar did not relish the slaughter of his enemies. Now he prayed for their souls. The Frenchmen he killed were not evil men, only misled. But Guerin had been right in his prediction. To the north, the French were fortifying Haute Louisiane with several forts and colonies around ancient Cahokia. To the south, the French were establishing Basse Louisiane with colonies at Biloxi, Mobile, and Fort Maurepas. The Natchez were the only thing keeping the French and Eos from a conquest of the Mississippi River. One of his Natchez warriors came running to him. "Did we hold the flank?" Gaspar asked. "We did, and we managed to capture their leader. And the rest of the French? Eliminated. Bring me their leader, alive and unharmed." As Gaspar waited, he thought of the others doing their part in the great drama. He thought of his Petun people living near Fort Detroit, where the colonists promised would be the extent of their interests. He thought of the Chippewa, who relentlessly pressed to fulfill their prophecies. On the other side, he thought of Waukesha, Keoksa, and Sweet Winona, who defended the lands of the Blue Woman from the inevitable. Gaspar turned to the carnage around him, where the blood of 36 dead men melted through the snow and ice to join the great river. The young men celebrated another victory, yet Gaspar yearned for the days of violence to be over. "Where are you, Guerin? How much longer must I play the part of Samson, holding back the Philistine hordes?" The prisoner brought to him was a Frenchman in his mid-40s. When they tossed him onto his belly, the man rose slowly onto all fours before sitting on his haunches. His eyes did not look up from the ground. "What is your name?" Gaspar asked in French. "Nicolas Chauvin," he answered. "Well, Monsieur Chauvin, fate has smiled on you today. We're going to send you back down the river with a message to the men who sent you. Tell them the lands of the Natchez will never belong to the French." Finally, Chauvin looked up, locking eyes for just a moment before flinching and looking back. Was that fear or recognition? It had been almost a decade since Chief Kondiaronk died in Montreal, and aside from aging, Gaspar dressed in the manner of the local Natchez. It must be fear. "Escort Monsieur Chauvin back into the Choctaw territory. He carries an important message for his friends," Gaspar said. Chauvin glanced up one final time before being led away. "The first step of my new strategy. Gather the men, but only the young men without families," Gaspar insisted. Even though he had promised Guerin to hold the position as long as possible, the southern colonies grew stronger by the day. Doing the same thing again and again was a recipe for defeat. "I have to try something different." Within moments, his other officers, wondering what the next move would be, began to gather. "I sent their leader back, which will only harden their resolve," Gaspar explained. "They will be resolved to hit us twice as hard and has twice as many men next year. But by that time, we'll be hundreds of miles from here." "Are we going north?" his officers wondered, also sensing the relentless tide of French bodies being thrown at them. "No, the French are even stronger in the north. We're going to flank them through the territories of Atakpa and Chittamauga. When they come up the Mississippi River in force, we'll destroy their unguarded territories. We'll crush the egg in the nest. It'll be a decisive victory, or a good death." The War of Spanish Succession, which began in 1701 under Charles II of Spain, died without children, saw a shift in power in 1710. For the early parts of the war, France championed the Bourbon heir Philip of Anjou and seemed to impose its will. However, the Grand Alliance, England, the Holy Roman Empire, the Dutch Republic, Prussia, and pro-Habsburg Spain, endured the early years as they stood behind their choice for the Spanish Empire's throne, Charles VI. The stalemate began to inevitably crumble when England tired of war and elected a pro-peace Tory government in 1710. The Grand Alliance quickly began negotiating treaties that would lead to peace. Despite the political shift at home, England managed to secure a key victory in North America. While attempts to gain territory in the Gulf of Mexico failed, since France maintained Louisiana and Spain kept Florida, American colonists first won the Battle of St. John in Newfoundland and then took the capital of Acadia, Port Royal. Although the French Navy remained strong, the American ground forces led by Sir Francis Nicholson effectively established a new English colony of Nova Scotia. For boatswain Jimmy Duke, the winds off the coast of New England brought memories of home. Even though Boston was only a few hundred miles south of Acadia, it still felt a million miles away. I've spent more of my life on a ship than I ever did in Boston, he reflected. But when he left with Captain Kidd in 1695, he assumed he'd spend the winter in the Caribbean before returning to a dreary life as a fisherman. What fishing crew would hire me now? I'm almost 40. I could buy a spot along a bar in some tavern and tell tales for the rest of my life that no man would believe. Or I could finish this adventure and buy a tavern. The White Zombie blindly approached Acadia from the deep waters of the Atlantic. Duke had helped Narrow Bond navigate the fishing grounds to Sable Island, where they encountered fishermen who updated them on colonial news. Now, after spending the last 2 nights taking careful astronomical measurements, they chose a sliver of continent for their approach. According to Guerin, they'd only get one chance to do it right. It had been the fugitive Lahontan who fled the continent at Acadia 2 decades earlier. The crime? Although the talk around the Boston taverns had been that the young baron fled with his tail between his legs after putting his tail between the governor's daughter's legs, Louis Armand Guerin later told a far more sinister tale of why a death warrant had been issued for his head. After all that Duke had seen, he knew Guerin told the truth. Yet, looking upon the dark wooded shore, the tale seemed unbelievable. An ancient treasure vault? Who would bother to put anything here? The spotters shouted out confirmation of the required landmarks to the 40-mile window of the horizon. To the north of the large bay, the presence of a fishing village was noticed. To the south of the large bay, a wide, deep river came rushing down to meet the Atlantic. Ahead of them, 100 islands spread across the deep bay. Guerin, Farrow, Lesueur, and Bond gathered together on the rear deck as they used their looking glasses to note the islands and compared them to the charts. The White Zombie came straight toward the continent while the crew looked for any nearby vessels that could bear witness to the former Mughal warship entering American territory. Even though Port Royal, the largest settlement upon the peninsula, was on the inner shore, Guerin did not want to risk being spotted by a British patrol. "Looks like we got it right," Duke assessed when all the scopes were lowered and Captain Guerin quickly walked back towards the cabin. Confirmation made, the White Zombie pivoted back to the deep waters from whence they'd come, and Duke prepared his crew to make deep anchor on the Emerald Basin. When dusk came, they returned to Acadia under cover of darkness, and then, for the next 2 days, he'd become the newest captain of the White Zombie. Despite the promotion, Jimmy Duke grit his teeth in frustration. I wish I could be with them when they land upon Oak Island. Chapter 95, Oak Island, Acadia, 1711. Under cover of darkness, the 3 skiffs landed upon the uniform gravel of the small cove. Louis Armand Guerin turned back to where the White Zombie anchored a few hundred yards away. As instructed, no light came from the ship. Starlight and a sliver of moon created enough to silhouette the ship against the backdrop of the Atlantic, but in front of them, a deep darkness hid the contents of Oak Island. To his left, Lesueur, Horn, Naufragio, and Papa Bones began to unload the equipment from their skiff. To his right, Del Toro, Barrow, Murray, and Bond began to pull their skiff further onto the shore. Along with Professor Farrow, Guerin rowed with 2 of the original Abyssinian boys, now grown men. Once the 12 stood upon the shore, Guerin knelt down, drawing all eyes. "Notice anything strange, gentlemen?" Lesueur kicked at the gravel. Horn scanned the dark horizon of the night. Only Pharaoh noticed, commenting, "The gravel is very uniform, as if it has been poured." 300 yards of false shoreline, Garen declared. He stood and pointed up and down the cove. "Is the treasure below us?" Del Toro asked. "No," Garen chuckled. Naufragio asked how deep the pit was, and this gives his answer. "I don't understand," the carpenter admitted. So Garen asked, "Why would you build a false shore with poured gravel?" No one answered. "Okay then, I'll ask another question. If you had the most valuable treasure hoard known to the world, why would you keep it unguarded?" "It's booby-trapped," Pharaoh said. "Just like the Well of Initiation back on Madagascar. When I was last here, it was daylight, so excuse me if I missed the mark on the first attempt. Master Bon, I want you to count off the paces from the beach. Follow me, gentlemen." Shaped like a young elephant, Oak Island stretched less than a mile from trunk to tail. Beginning at the neck of the cove, Garen walked the men into the heart of the island. Part of the brilliance of the vault was that no signs of civilization had been allowed. Only upon close inspection did the first clue become obvious: the sessile oaks. Now protected by the curtain of trees, the men lit the lanterns and continued walking. "Do you see those branches above our heads?" Garen asked. The men looked up to the twisted branches. "Oak trees are not indigenous to these islands, so to make it easier to find this island, they raised all the pine and cedar and planted oaks." "How do you know this?" Dr. Barrow asked. "When I fled Montreal, I was forced to wait for a ship to extract me. While I waited, I took the opportunity to come explore this island. The periphery has heard rumors of it for some time, but most of my superiors dismissed the legends of an ancient king from a forgotten kingdom, despite the obvious signs when settlers began to cross the Atlantic." "What signs?" Narrowbon asked. "Tell him about the new Pert Tower, Professor Pharaoh." "Oh dear, it's the bane of my existence. It's what drew me into this mess." As they walked, Pharaoh explained the Norse tower built in the colony that now bore its ironic namesake, Rhode Island. He then added several more anecdotes that supported Norse exploration centuries prior to Columbus. "If I were to guess, I'd say the Templars came in the 1300s with the belief they were about to build a new colony." Narrowbon, the navigator, understood. "And the Templars knew the latitude of the Lost Kingdom." 44 degrees north latitude, Garen added. "Of course, they had different systems based upon stars, but it led them across the Atlantic and right into the continent of America." At first, Oak Island became a landmark. Much later, it became a symbolic vault. I'll show you. After a short walk, the oak canopy opened to a clearing about the size of a home. "My guess is that Eos sends some sort of maintenance crew that visits on a regular basis. Those branches were cut so they could find the pit, and every few decades they put more dirt over the pit and reposition the flagstones just below the surface." He knelt down and reached out his hand, his fingers gently touching fallen leaves before he aggressively pushed it away, taking dirt and debris with it. "We should have brought shovels," Del Toro muttered. "Already complaining, and we've been ashore less than 10 minutes, Garen observed. "That is the reason why I left you on the ship in Africa, but you've earned this honor." Digging like a dog, Garen quickly removed enough dirt for confirmation. "There you are," he said once his fingers felt flat stone. He stood back up, allowing the shuttered light of the lanterns to illuminate the hole for the others to see. "It's flagstone." He looked back up at the monstrous oak with 3 overhanging limbs that had nearly been hacked off above the place where they stood. He'd stood in the same place before, years earlier. Have I lost 18 years of my life to this quest? 18 years since I fled the continent. The men who'd seen the church in the clouds, the floating church, the churches carved from stone within, stood with those who hadn't, Del Toro and Papa Bones. Their collective hands cleared away the rest of the dirt to reveal 3 exposed flagstones. Del Toro didn't seem impressed. They placed the flagstones a few feet below the surface to keep subsidation from revealing the pit, Garen explained, stepping back. Didn't seem to work, LeSueur said, stepping away of the perimeter of the depression. It wasn't a large depression, only 10 yards in diameter. Well, it's been over 300 years since the pit was made, Charlie. The flagstones have done their job. The rest of this island is slate and bedrock, except for here, of course. Carved out by Shamir, Pharaoh muttered. The entire crew now understood the Shamir. It had been a long journey from Abyssinia to Acadia. The first experiment had been conducted off an unnamed, uninhabited island near Socotra. With Solomon's ring and a lead container of Shamir, LeSueur used a lead cup to extract a small amount before quickly resealing the container, which was immediately brought back to the ship for safety. The small cup transformed into a vaporous whirlwind that violently lashed out, kicking up wind and debris that reached the ship anchored hundreds of yards away. LeSueur had once again been left unharmed, but had failed to command anything, leaving him ankle-deep in the Indian Ocean. A second experiment was conducted weeks earlier on Madagascar. Returning to the spot where the adventure galley had ambushed Blackbeard's ship, LeSueur repeated the experiment at the base of the mountain. Once again, the small extraction of Shamir attacked everything around it, except for LeSueur, who failed a second time to command the spirits within the substance. The failed experiment led them to the literal breakthrough. The unleashed Shamir ate away at jungle, foliage, and stone, opening a large crevice into the underground structure. There, Pharaoh found the prize that had eluded Emperor Aurangzeb and Thomas II, the sarcophagus. The third experiment did not happen immediately. After leaving Abyssinia, Garen privately visited with Queen Rhaena, who anticipated the return of Prince Laho after pretending to be Newton's loyal servant over the past few years. He left her with more promises, and she, in turn, supplied them for their return voyage to the west. Once they sailed, Professor Pharaoh worked on his translation, focusing upon the foreign words carved into the ring. Off the coast of Morocco, LeSueur tried the experiment a third time, this time uttering the same words Solomon had uttered. The demons obeyed, leaving a cylindrical hole at LeSueur's feet when it was all over. Garen had stood beside LeSueur for a fourth experiment, and afterwards set his course for Oak Island. If I were to venture a guess, Garen said to Pharaoh, I'd guess the Templars of old had a superior knowledge of the Shamir, and even without Solomon's ring, they used it to bore through the slate and bedrock. Remember, the Templar Knights trace their lineage back to the stonemasons of Hyre Mabif Tyre. What about the treasure? Del Toro asked. Garen turned to Narrowban. How many paces did we walk from the cove? Approximately 300 paces, Ban answered quickly. This central chasm would have been used to lower down treasure into a vault, much like the Well of Initiation was built. Pharaoh, tell these men how the central chasm was constructed. A spiral staircase surrounded the central chasm, and at the bottom, chambers were built off to the sides of the chasm. The men who built the Well of Initiation in Madagascar were likely the same generation of masons. Covering up the vault was their way of locking it, and as Newton the Priory discovered, trying to rob the contents of the vault ended up locking it up against even more secure. Ah, the booby traps, Del Toro said in understanding. The false beach is used to collect water to flood the pit, Pharaoh both explained and concluded. Garen nodded. Exactly. And based on the distance, slope, and angle between the shore and the pit, I'd guess the two met almost 100 feet underground. A foolish intruder would trigger the release valves and flood the pit with 70 feet of water. But more than just the volume of water, it connected to the ocean itself, Barrow answered. And not even Thor could drain it, Pharaoh finished. If the pit was the opening to the vault, it was also meant to be the focus of attention. And if someone went through all the efforts of creating a vault of such complexity, he had to value the treasure he kept. Why would he let it be destroyed by seawater? A gopher hole, the sewer said. It goes deeper into the ground than the nest, so that when the rain comes, the gopher and its babies are protected in a pocket of air. My thoughts exactly, yet there is no back door to reach this gopher nest, and the front door is a death trap, which means we will do something the Templars did not anticipate. Garin took measured paces away from the center of the covered pit, and standing near a rooted tree, he stomped his foot down. Here, we'll create a side tunnel here. Are you ready, LeSueur? It's time to command demons. Chapter 96. Fie on it, LeSueur thought, channeling the dark side of his mixed ancestry. He took out the lead box, pulled out the ancient ring, and once more slid it onto his finger. Aside from a strange feeling of euphoria, nothing dramatic happened. Except for Garin and Pharaoh, the others all stepped away from him, giving him dozens of yards of room. Garin held the lead vat of Shamir. Pharaoh held the translation. Remember, measure out only a small amount. Once the first measure is exhausted, we'll need the second measure to close it back up. Why do we care about closing it? LeSueur asked. I don't want Eos to know we were here, Garin said with a shrug. It'll be funny if one day they go to open the vault and find that it's empty. Do you really think that it is down here? Pharaoh asked. I hope it is down there, Garin said. But I'll take whatever we find. Are you ready, Charlie? LeSueur nodded. Be ready with the rope. Garin stepped back to the others, leaving just Pharaoh, who stood midway between. LeSueur cracked the seal and opened the lead vat, scooping out a small amount of the strange liquid. He quickly resealed the larger vessel and took several strides away from the open container. Garin rushed forward, hustling the remaining Shamir to safety. Once again, Pharaoh stood alone, lantern in one hand and translated pages on the other. While Thomas, too, had been quite wrong about the safety of standing on the deck of the ship, he'd been equally right about the ancient sarcophagus found in Arabia. Professor Pharaoh immediately recognized the Hebrew language written upon it, and after extrapolating the missing vowel sounds, matched it up to the language that Solomon had also managed to crack. Now, with an imperfect knowledge, Pharaoh began to feed the syllables of the dead language. A wave of hatred swept over LeSueur, and he found himself grimacing in emotional agony. Not my hatred. It's the demons within the Shamir. Professor Pharaoh had no certainty, but during the crossing, he'd offered theories about Solomon. Biblically, it chronicled how wise Solomon fell from grace and worshipped the gods of his foreign wives. In folklore, a more explicit tale was told involving a demon named Asmodeus. Depending on the telling, Solomon duped the demon into acquiring the secret knowledge once used to forge the Philosopher's Stone. Enslaved by King Solomon, Asmodeus, in turn, tricked his captor once the temple was complete. Take off my chain. Take the chain off me and give me the ring, Asmodeus baited King Solomon, who acquiesced, only to have the demon attack him and cast him far from Israel. Solomon learned the powerful nature of his ring. With his ring as a catalyst, Solomon commanded the demons into a new prison, the Shamir. LeSueur watched as a cupful of the vile substance began to expand. As before, he repeated the syllables to command the substance. The vapor spread out around his feet like a large cobra, But before he'd finished the first command, it snapped like a whip to strike Pharaoh, the lantern tumbling from his hands, resulting in a fireball that ignited the professor's wool jacket. Chaos ensued. Some ran away, some ran forward. Slimy little bastard, Lesueur thought as his heel crushed the vapor. Then his mouth opened to continue the next syllable. As a literate boy, he'd been given to the Jesuits, who immediately noted his ability. Not only had Lesueur mastered Latin, but he'd also learned English on the trip from France to Montreal. From there, he learned the languages of the Iroquois, Huron, Petun, Winnebago, Fox, Chippewa, Miami, and finally the Dakota. While puberty eventually gave reason for men to fear him, his truest strength had always been an ease with languages. Even though he knew little about the ancient king or his lost kingdom, Lesueur continued to utter all the words written down on Pharaoh's burning piece of paper. His commands took hold of the raging cloud, which returned back to a small sphere around him. Down, you filth, down. The Shamir obeyed, and whatever divine spark that had been given to the morning stars during creation still allowed the demonic Shamir to transform the elements from under Lesueur's feet. Like standing upon quicksand, he descended past the horizon of horrified friends into a confined darkness where the bluish-green glow of the nebulous Shamir reflected off of solid stone. How far do I descend? To the gates of Sheol? Lesueur's answer came when his slow descent ended in an abrupt drop. Traitorous whore! Lesueur thought the Shamir had turned on him, but he felt cold stone against his throbbing cheek, ribs, and knee. Above him, he saw the Shamir still swirling near the ceiling in the captivity. It had just formed. Enough, he ordered, and with a glance at his ring, he uttered the final syllables. The Shamir vanished like smoke, leaving him in total darkness. I'm through, damn it, he shouted. Where are you sons of bitches? Send down a torch or something, you bastards. Lesueur felt his hands clenched and then remembered the ring. As soon as he removed it, his fear, rage, and hatred vanished like the Shamir. Charlie? Garen asked. I found the chamber. What do you see? It's dark, Lesueur stated the obvious. Send down a lantern on a rope. As the lantern appeared, the light looked like an angel descending from the heavens, but when it crossed from chasm into chamber, the light revealed a room filled with a flickering light of gold. Lesueur's heart fluttered with joy and despair. The room extended in a rectangle that stretched about 20 yards wide by 60 feet long, an astonishing feat of masonry. Within it, though, were 24 golden relics, the wrong relics. Each and every one of them appeared to be Egyptian. What's happening, Charlie? Garen's voice called down. Is it safe to come down? Lesueur untied the lantern and answered back. It's a vault full of treasure, but... The man on the surface rejoiced. Lesueur began to walk away. His gopher theory proved to be true. At the narrow end of the chamber, a small ramp descended. Lesueur followed it. It led to the narrow spiral staircase anticipated by Pharaoh, which meant the false door of the covered central chasm was likely a trap. Lesueur took a few steps around the arc of the staircase and found another opening. This one did not lead to another room. Instead, it was a sloping ramp leading up to the surface, a secret entrance. From the angle, it likely was 100 paces from the obvious center of the pit and small enough to be discreetly hidden. Returning to the spiral, he continued to the next opening. Inside, he found a collection of prehistoric art, sculptures, and runestones. His pace hurried, and in the fourth opening, he almost dropped the lamp as he paused in the entryway. He found himself breathing hard as his heart thumped in his chest. A new light appeared from the first chamber. Where are you, Charlie? Here, he said with dampened voice. He glanced once more and closed his eyes. Garen rounded the staircase, and with a grin on his face, "Can you believe it?" Lesueur shook his head. "What's wrong?" "Look inside," Lesueur said. Garen stopped in his tracks, and his free hand reached for the edge of the opening to find his balance. It's... Looks like we're going to make Benjamin Horne a happy man. Chapter 97, Oak Island, Acadia, 1711. Josiah Farrow realized he'd been curled up in a ball, still smoldering a bit, and he unwrapped himself to crawl on his hands and knees to the opening in the earth. Giovanni Naufragio, the ship's carpenter, was the first to climb out of the hole. His breathing was labored from more than just exertion. Farrow extended a hand to Naufragio, who grabbed it and said, "It's beyond reason," before crawling out on all fours, collapsing onto his chest, and then turning back to look at the gaping hole in the ground. "Unbelievable," he muttered, and patted Farrow's shoulder. "I could use your help." Farrow rose and followed him through the darkness of the small oak forest to the northern shore. Still tucked into the rocky shore, the three boats waited. "Hold this," Naufragio said, and a great bundle of ropes filled Farrow's arms. For a moment, he wrestled with the cluster until he slipped an arm into the center and then held the weight upon his shoulder. A moment later, a hammer, saw, and canvas bag balanced his weight. Naufragio paused from his efforts to lift the lantern, opening its shutters 4 times in slow increments, a sign to the anchored ship that things were underway. "I can't believe we're doing this," the carpenter muttered. With a bundle of small beams upon his shoulders, he carried the lantern in his free hand as they walked back through the oak forest. As they walked, Farrow recalled a story from antiquity, a Persian tale about a boy who is ensnared by an evil sorcerer who uses him as a sacrifice to gain entry into a booby-trapped cave. Have I lost my mind? Am I insane, stuck on an island dying of thirst, imagining that I am Aladdin? If anything, he'd already had too much water as he watched his friends descend into the pit. The weight of the ropes felt real, as did the tools he carried. The man in front of him, his shipmate for the past 2 years, also seemed authentic, and not just some shape-shifting djinn who took on human form. Returning to the opening that looked like the gateway to hell, Farrow could see the open lanterns below, casting strange shadows and reflections in the chamber. The carpenter began barking out orders, and Farrow gladly followed, if only to quiet his mind. In the tale, Aladdin was tricked by the sorcerer into entering the cave to retrieve a treasure, and then found himself trapped on the inside with a ring. The irony was too much, and Farrow refused to recall the tale further. "Now help me drag it over the pit," Naufragio said. The wooden tripod fit over the top of the hole in the ground, which Farrow helped create with only the syllables from his mouth. The ring worked, as Garen long ago predicted, and the elements, earth, air, fire, water, obeyed. Thomas, too, had promised an adventure, which hadn't been a lie, yet the all-expenses-paid trip around the world had come at a steep cost, his stolen life. The ropes and pulleys were now in place, and Farrow could hear the men below. Risking a view, he leaned over the hole. "Dear Lord, what have we done?" Farrow muttered when he saw what filled the hole below them. "Be careful. Don't touch it or you'll fall down dead." Louis Armand Guerin leaned into the illuminated space below, showing gloved hands. "Don't worry, Professor. We're taking all precautions. It's only a replica, remember? The real one and its location is kept secret." If that isn't the real Ark of the Covenant, I don't know what is. The golden box seemed to emanate light, but with the open lanterns, the polished surfaces could have been simply reflecting the light. Men scaled the sides of the pit, and soon Lesueur and the others gathered around, each taking hold of the rope connected to Naufragio's rigging. Once out of the pit, the chest seemed diminished, smaller. "We must get it to the ship at once," Horne said, assuming command. "His mission is over, it seems." The treasure stolen by the Templars centuries ago was now being returned to Abyssinia, where only the high priest knew the truth. Pharaoh escorted the relic to the rowboat when they loaded the chest into one and towed it with the other. Horn and Naufragio steadily took the treasure toward the anchored ship, which came to life as Del Toro opened and closed the shutter of his lantern, giving another signal everything was clear. You just going to stand around gawking, or are you going to help?" Del Toro asked, and walked back to the opening. When they returned to the chasm in the earth, Pharaoh did not hesitate this time. He followed, shocked at how slippery and perfectly smooth the walls were. Although the golden glow had left with the ark, the lantern light still cast surreal illuminations in the chamber below. Charlie and Papa Bones dragged the chest to where Pharaoh dropped onto the floor. Surrounding the single chest were dozens of other treasures. "We're going to need a larger ship," Papa Bones flashed a toothless grin. Garen stood a few paces back with arms crossed. "Nice of you to join us. This is all a bit much. I've been investigating mythology and legend for my whole life, but I never imagined that I could use your help prioritizing the rest of the treasure. Come, let me show you what I'm dealing with." For the next hour, Pharaoh walked through time as he tried to identify the stolen treasures of the legendary Templar Knights. Garen ordered most of the Egyptian artifacts to be loaded onto the ship, knowing he'd make a fortune in selling them. "The Odin Stone?" Garen asked. "Some of it certainly early Goth, but I don't see anything as critical or unique as the Odin Stone. I guess these are ancient family heirlooms. Unfortunately, our hold cannot carry much more of this loot," Garen said with a shrug. "Our crew will certainly leave fortunes to their descendants, won't they? If we live long enough to spend it." "Good point. Let's leave a message for Eos to discover." "A message?" Garen secured a hammer and chisel. "One day, when they believe the time is right, Eos will come for their treasure. So let's leave them an idea who got the better of them." Garen handed Pharaoh a hammer and chisel, and the two quickly went to work, leaving their names etched in the stone at the bottom of the pit. Chapter 98, Mississippi River Delta, 1711. Edward Drummond understood how the great explorer La Salle missed the Mississippi River Delta. The mighty river that ran through a continent fanned out into several muddy fingers of a peninsula that jutted out into the Gulf. None of the little fingers seemed substantial enough to matter. For that reason, La Salle kept sailing west, where he died in a mutiny in Texas. The issues that led the Lemoyne family to build their Gulf colonies 100 miles away from the Delta, where a deeper bay allowed much better navigation to Fort Maurepas, Biloxi, and Mobile. The mud flats also prompted Drummond to anchor 2 miles past the silty water to be sure his hull wouldn't get stuck. 3 factors led him to return to the colony. First, Culliford and Swan returned to the Caribbean with 3 ships that could join the pirate fleet in exchange for, as they put it, their retirement. Drummond granted them their wish. The second factor had been an empty hull. Back in Bermuda, his divers scoured the wreck of the Berger with no success, leading Drummond to an obvious conclusion. Lesueur lied. Yes, the ship sank. Yes, there'd been a fire, but the Philosopher's Stone could not be found. The third factor had been a cry for help. 2 major attacks had occurred over the summer from the Natchez Indians on the colonies. Instead of simply defending their territory, the Natchez came down the river to uproot the colonists. To strike quickly, the Natchez used canoes. Despite a clear autumn sky, Drummond heard the thunder of cannon fire. He smiled, thinking of Patrick Dalziel's ambush location in the mud flats. His orders had been clear. Wait for the flotilla to pass by, and then unleash hell upon them. Before spreading out in a 30-mile fan, the Mississippi River Delta passed through a muddy neck just 3 miles wide. That was where Dalziel waited. Now, trapped in the delta, the Natchez had no choice than to try to flee forward, where Joseph Lemoyne's Griffin and Antoine Lemoyne's Salamandre guarded the other large outlets. Drummond nodded to his master gunner, who had the cannons ready to fire. Knowing the Natchez canoes posed no threat to a warship, all 4 vessels kept only their gun crew and loaded a fighting force of 400 men into skiffs that now waited at every turn for the fleeing Natchez. First, I win the Battle of the Delta. Then, I conquer the whole continent. Chapter 99, Bermuda, 1712. Pierre-Charles Le Sueur did not sleep that night, and he found himself at the railing of the rear deck as a gray dawn greeted the White Zombie. He, along with Narrowbond's crewmen up in the rigging, waited for a sign of Bermuda. Garin's cunning and patience is far beyond what I gave him credit for, Le Sueur decided as he shivered in the cold morning air. Even after extracting the Templar treasure, they lingered near New England, leaving Jimmy Duke and Drake Murray behind for a covert mission. Even after leaving the 2 trust officers behind, they lingered in New England for another 2 months. Just like with the crossing from the Indian Ocean, Garin made use of every port to send out his letters to his mysterious superiors. 20 years ago, I thought Garin fled the continent a beaten man, but even in defeat, he knew how to best his enemies. Instead of spotting the island, the call came down from the rigging about spotting a sail. Le Sueur strained his eyes to match what was seen, but before he could find it, another call went out spotting a second sail. The entire crew came to life like an angry nest of ants. A third call went out before Garin stepped onto the deck. Land. 700 miles west of the continent, Bermuda remained a vital port in Atlantic travel. As the northernmost Caribbean island, it had been selected by Garin as a rendezvous. During the War of Spanish Succession, it had fallen into French and Spanish control for a time. But now it was back in British control as the war wound down in Europe. In passing, Garin gave his familiar nod and wink. We'll see if he's smiling after I tell him. Now, Garin pointed to the 2 ships anchored off the northern tip of Bermuda, just as he promised. The lucky bastard. The 2 ships were the Malay and the Daphne, both known to senior crew members. The White Zombie approached and then anchored. A few hours later, from the port of Hamilton, the Phoebe and the Eurydice joined them a few miles from the island. Le Sueur knew where they anchored, even if no one else, except for Garin, understood why and where they met. As the 5 ships came together, Le Sueur pulled over the elder member of the crew, Narrowbond. Can we trust these people? Le Sueur asked. No, Bond answered too quickly. Luckily, none of them know what's in our hold, do they? Why don't we just sail back to Abyssinia? Le Sueur asked. Garin always has several irons in the fire, Bond said with a shrug. He befriended Athena when he was still first mate to Captain Kidd. You know how he is with the ladies. Athena, Le Sueur repeated, remembering how close he'd come to death during torture at her hands. The only woman captain I know of, Bond said, and tapped his temple. She's some sort of mathematical genius, if you can believe it from looking at her. I'm just glad Garin never replaced me with her. She's a skilled navigator, apparently, who warms a bed even better. Seeing her boarding the White Zombie gave Le Sueur chills. She's been passed around by several captains until she became a sylph. A sylph? That's what they call themselves. They have Huguenot loyalties. French Protestants bound together by faith. They're refugees. Bond nodded. The Huguenots back on Tortuga helped hide us after Captain Kidd was arrested, and in turn, Garin made them promises as only he can. What did he promise them? Help. They helped him, so he promised to help them in turn. The poor Huguenots are being crushed between the Catholic nations of Spain and France and the Anglican British Empire. They've got no one to protect them from pirates on either side of the war. He's giving them some of the treasure? Oh, I hope not. Do you remember our stops at the Gold Coast? He's planning something big, I think. He asks me frequently about the lengths of trips to places all over the globe. Do you know why we've come here? This isn't a safe port for us to linger. Lesueur knew. Narrow Bond deserved an honest answer. November 1701. He told of his former ship, Le Berger, and the escort ship Naudinier, departing Fort Maurepas in the New Louisiana Territory, established by his Lemoyne in-laws. Then Lesueur explained how the heavily armed convoy resupplied at Bermuda prior to taking a route less traveled back to France. Just as he'd done for men far more powerful than Bond, he told the harrowing tale of how the ship burst into flame and took everything down into the depths of the Atlantic, including the Philosopher's Stone, Bond said, and with raised eyebrows looked over the edge of the ship. By noon, Lesueur sat at a table filled with captains Vincent Galloway, Archibald Vero, and Willow Thomas, Wart Jacobs, and Athena McCormack, all criminals yet allies. Also at the table sat Garen's guests, Josiah Farrow and Benjamin Horn. While I certainly have important news, I'm curious about any news from Europe, Garen began, particularly from Königsberg Castle. Prussia. Lesueur's head hurt as he transitioned from supernatural thoughts of the Ark Ring and Stone to that of politics. Curious you should mention that, Captain Vero coyly added. I've just returned from a trip to the Baltic Sea and happened to make port in Gdansk. You did? Do tell, Garen grinned. The old Brandenburg Navy is no more, Captain Vero explained. King Frederick of Prussia, as it is now called, has none of his father's interest in his recently built merchant navy, and even in being a colonial power. His focus on developing an army required an influx of finance, and he decided to sell off his father's legendary fleet for pennies on the dollar, even the new warships. Indeed, Garen continued toying, who has the resources to make such a purchase? Vero shrugged. No one knows. It's all quite mysterious. Then Garen grew serious. How soon until they arrive in Bermuda? A fleet of warships? Assuming your envoys safely traveled from Boston to London, Athena McCormack said in reference to Jimmy Duke and Drake Murray's covert mission to the Atlantic, and assuming your Brandenburg allies were ready to sail, they couldn't possibly arrive for another 9 days, but that could also be 9 weeks also. Can you give me 10 days? Garen finally asked after all the concerns were given. Before you arrived, we spotted salvage ships in the area, Wart Jacobs added. They didn't move when they saw us, but whenever the British Navy showed up, they bolted like scared rabbits. Eos ships, Garen theorized. Most likely former Madagascar pirates. He turned to Lesueur, adding, I'd bet you're Captain Blackbeard, or Dalziel. Hopefully it was too deep to recover anything of value. What of it? Wart Jacobs continued, we can't just anchor here for 10 days. It isn't safe. We're a target for all enemies. When the Sylph captains hesitated, concerned about being gathered together in one place for too long, Garen conceded. Fine. I don't want us all anchored together like this either. In fact, I'd prefer it if the 4 of you circled the island at a distance, making sure none of our enemies come from America or from the south. For now, we have time on our side. They agreed to 2 weeks. I shouldn't feel bad about keeping my secret when he keeps plans to himself. Finally, Garen did explain the next step. When our new fleet, the former Brandenburg Navy, eventually arrives under the guidance of Admirals Duke and Murray, he said with a wide grin, I will accompany Benjamin Horn and the treasure on a return trip to Africa. where I promised Queen Rehena help in ridding her country of the remaining pirates. In my absence, I'll give Charlie command of the White Zombie, and with the support of the Sylphs, they will return to Tortuga to wait the final stage of the mission. LeSueur had heard enough. Final stage? Surely you must understand why we are meeting in Bermuda. Do you think the quest was over? As long as we have the ring, we can finish this fight with Eos, and the ring will be returned with me to Abyssinia, Horn insisted. Garen shook his head slowly. That was never part of the deal. I helped recover what was stolen from your country by the Templars. That was the promise I made you. I only promised the priest that we would use it wisely, which we did, and we will. It's not your relic. It belongs back at Abuna Yamatagu. It belonged in Jerusalem, but your King Lalabella had no qualms using it to build his New Israel, did he? I have need of it also. I need it for several reasons, in fact, beginning with a special purpose here in Bermuda. He expects the ring to retrieve the Philosopher's Stone from the depths. LeSueur exhaled, and even though it was inadvertent, he drew the attention of everyone, including Garen. Is there something you wish to tell us, Charlie? There's something you need to know, LeSueur said, but I must tell it to you first in private. Chapter 100, Bermuda, 1712. Luis Armand folded his arms as he sat at the edge of the table in his cabin. LeSueur looked back and closed the door. I thought we had this all sorted out. What did you do, Bonjean? LeSueur shook his head. No. I need to first understand your intentions. My intentions? Garen laughed, flashing a bit of anger. Aren't my intentions obvious? Then be clear. Say them. Okay, I intend to find the wreckage of the Burger, and once located, use the ring to command the elements, or even the Philosopher's Stone itself, to rise to the surface. They both use the same dark magic, even if they do not share the same maker. If the ring can penetrate stone, I don't see why it can't open the depths. And then? My mission is complete. I came to the continent 2 decades ago with orders to investigate the rumors of the stone. I ascertained, and now I mean to acquire. You're doing it for your own glory. I don't believe you. Karen scoffed. If there's anybody with credibility issues, it's you, bear man. You've been carrying around your secret like it's a warm buffalo hide. I already have a good idea what you're going to tell me. Fine, but I do not understand what you're hiding, LeSueur said, pacing around the room while Garen sat in one spot. Let's say the Philosopher's Stone is resting on the table behind you. What happens next? Are you worried I'll drop it over the side of the ship? Don't be foolish. I might not have liked either Bonjean or LeSueur. Charlie and I are friends. If the stone rested on the table, my mission would be over, and I could follow the advice of my friend rather than any oaths that I swore to the Periphery. Here's what I understand. Your Phantom Fleet is arriving to take Horn and the Ark back where it belongs. Will the Philosopher's Stone go with it? He's bluffing, but why? I suppose that depends on what we find on the ocean floor. No. We've already established that it is sitting on the table behind you. Where does it go next? LeSueur asked. Garen talked slowly as if to a child. The Order of Eos, as we speak, is creating a new utopia in the American colonies. And down in the Gulf, they've already established a position at the delta of the Mississippi. Surely he understands the lore surrounding the Low One. LeSueur shook his head. Here's what I don't understand. I publicly failed. I privately failed. I limped back to France with my tail between my legs, having lost a ship, and more important, the Philosopher's Stone to the depths of the Atlantic. The copper vitriol I returned with was discredited as worthless, and my public mission to establish a copper mine was viewed with ridicule, and don't forget that Fort LaHillier was burned to the ground by the Fox shortly after your departure. LeSueur looked down. Despite all of that, I was rewarded with a leadership role in the new colony. Tell me, why was I being rewarded? You seem to have all the answers. Why was I being sent back? Why did you send Chief Gaspar to block the Mississippi? Is he daft, or is this rhetorical? I suppose there are some who doubt whether you found the stone. No, trust me, it has been found. It's sitting on the table behind you, LeSueur insisted sternly. Garen walked around to the other side, feigning that the hypothetical stone was real. Okay, Charlie, we'll be honest. I'd consider risking the dangers of bringing it back to Rome or even Abyssinia. But you have the might of the Brandenburg fleet. You can do whatever you want. Tempting, yes, but I also know that with the War of Spanish Succession distracting the whole of Europe now is the right time to strike, if it was right in front of me. Perhaps I'd send the stone with you, back to Tortuga, where the sylphs make port while also providing reasonable levels of protection. Once the Ark is returned, I could return with the fleet. Gaspar is already waiting for me in the Louisiana territory. He's been leading a coalition of native forces who harassed the French forces along the Mississippi River and keeping them in a defensive position. When the time is right, Spain will seize control of the Gulf. Spain? No, not truly Spain. It'll be me. The Brandenburg fleet will be dressed up as Spanish warships. So you're not planning on returning to Rome, LeSueur said with a nod. If you returned with the Brandenburg fleet, what would you do with this power? While France is trying to surround the English colony, Spain is doing the same thing to France with its colonies in Florida and Mexico. They are allies in a long war that is drawing to an end. By the time any real military forces arrive, we'll be gone. For I'll take the stone back up the river and finish things before anyone knows better. Finish things, LeSueur repeated and then added, I can't allow that. Is he getting senile in his old age? Surely he understands Eos is after more than just a key. LeSueur did not act senile. With narrowed eyes, he asked, and what if the Philosopher's Stone is not on the table between us? What if it is so deep in the ocean that it can never be found? Same plan, different key, Garen said flippantly. I need you to understand something. The Order of Eos will not stop. There's no reasoning with them, and there is no snapping them from their religious delusions. Their actions will either hasten the arrival of the fires of the end times or shatter the prophecy, delivering the world into the hands of a risen deity. Neither of those options sound pleasant, do they? While securing the Philosopher's Stone would certainly thwart their immediate plans, they would find another way. But just like I emptied their vault, I mean to empty a tomb. Whose tomb? Depends on who you ask. The Hebrews, the Phoenicians, the Priory, the Jesuits, the Chippewa, the Dakota, LeSueur added bitterly. Even Horn and the Abyssinians have a name for it, him. Eos seeks the tomb of one they refer to as Surtur's Bane. It's a bit complicated, but they believe they can resurrect or unearth this buried god who will lead them into a rebirth of humanity. With either Solomon's Ring or the Philosopher's Stone, we could help dig up this crusty corpse and steal him away from our enemies before they can wake him. And how would they wake him? Garen swallowed hard. Professor Farrow and I worry it has something to do with the Odin Stone, which contains a spell, verses, some sort of song. You saw how the Ring and Shamir responded. The Philosopher's Stone is much more powerful than either. The Philosopher's Stone never left the land of the Blue Woman. It felt as if LeSueur had scooped out the other eye. Garin grimaced in pain. A decade earlier, he would have killed LeSueur for the lie, but now he knew LeSueur to be something special. "So you're telling me there's nothing on this table?" Garin calmly said. "I carried a locked chest out along with barges of vitriol from that mine," LeSueur explained. "One look at the vitriol was all it took to convince the Lemoynes. I waited until we were to Bermuda before I personally sabotaged the ship." "Why?" "I had to protect Winona from the Order of Eos and the Priory of Ormus. I wanted them to believe it was at the bottom of the Atlantic. I wanted them to think all was lost." Garin let out a long groan. "The Periphery would have come to your aid." Wait. You left it with the Sioux?" "The priest back at Abuna Yamada Gu was right. The stone was evil. I couldn't put it back, and I didn't want to leave it with her to see it poison their hearts. So we did something not even Newton would suspect. We willingly gave it to the Fox Indians to protect." "So you have no idea where the Philosopher's Stone is right now?" Garin asked. LeSueur shook his head. "It was a short-sighted plan to keep her safe, but I had to trust it was the right thing to do." "This certainly changes things," Garin decided. "I might have underestimated your cunning, LeSueur." "Well played. Well played indeed." Chapter 101, 1712, Land of the Blue Woman. Winona shivered in the dark. Her buffalo blanket had slid off her legs as she slept, and winter's chill kept her from returning to sleep. Now 50, she slept alone without child or husband to keep her warm. It had been 2 years since her husband White Raven died, and both her boys had grown up and taken wives, leaving her surrounded by a new family, but still cold at night. At night, she felt old, when dreams and memories of countless winters came back to her. Instead of hoping for sleep to return, she dressed and stepped out of her teepee. Her family camped at the base of Bear Lodge, a solitary butte on the northeastern edge of the Black Hills. It had been her home since her father Wapisha gave her to White Raven in 1689. Their camp was nestled into the base of the mountain, sheltering them from the north wind. A canopy of stars filled the night sky. Glancing east, she saw not even the faintest glow of dawn yet. A walk will help. A walk will warm my body and clear my mind. Even though a Metawakitan, a dweller of Spirit Lake, she'd been born alongside water. She now considered herself a Blackfoot Lakota. Dwelling in the shadow of Inyan, the god who gave his life to form the stone foundations for mankind. Of all the tribes, bands, and camps of the mighty seven council fires, her new family belonged to a long line of priests and philosophers known as the Five Lodges Pilgrims. From the lake, forest, river, and plain came to their home for spiritual guidance and to pray atop the great stony butte. Even in the dark hour before dawn, her feet knew the path to the top of the mountain. By the time she sat down upon its ragged top, she once again felt the heat of youth pulsing through her veins. Even though her heart and lungs were agitated by the exertion, her mind was clear. LeSueur needs my prayers. Looking up at the expansive cosmos, she stared at the constellation that held so many meanings. To Pierre Charles LeSueur, the 7 stars represented the Great Bear, Ursa Major. To the people who waged war upon her eastern brothers, the 7 stars represented the Chippewa hero of the Fisher Cat, dared to battle the evil sorcerer known as the Wintermaker. To her people, the 7 stars were Tunwin, the Blue Woman. As a child, she knew her star was the top right, and that somewhere far to the left, across the Great Plains, the 7th star was the Lakota people. Now, she not only understood all 7 stars of the Blue Woman, but she also understood the reason she was blue. She fell in love with Asur the first moment she laid eyes upon him, for it was as if the Great Spirit had shaped the perfect man and dropped him onto earth as her rescuer. The serpent star appeared in the heavens to announce the arrival of the Wishwe, manifested in the form of a modest woods runner named Pierre Charles Lesueur. Yet fate had torn the 2 lovers apart after she brought him to see the place where the earth bled blue. After a decade apart, fate had brought both of them together again, and this time she was his rescuer. The French miners might have unearthed the sacred white egg known to Lesueur as the Philosopher's Stone, but only her bear man could hold it without being burned. Confirmation he was indeed the Wishwe. But the white stone swirled red with cursed blood, a sign of its evil presence. Some wanted to put it back in the ground. Others wanted to take it west, to keep it away from the Chippewa. Lesueur even offered to throw it into the Atlantic to protect her and White Raven's children. No, she told him, I agreed that we cannot put it back in the ground. My husband is right about it being a weapon, but the Serpent Star has left. You are no longer a young man. The elders at Bear Lodge felt the Serpent Star would bring a series of prophets to us until the time came for the final prophet, who would face No Soul. I thought I was supposed to face No Soul, Lesueur said, since he'd been able to handle the fire of the stone. I'm the Wishwe, right? You are one of the Wishwe. It is your destiny to unearth the stone, but to destroy it or throw it into the ocean would rob another of his destiny. If No Soul must be faced, we must make sure everything is in order when the time is right. I don't understand. If you don't want me facing No Soul, if you don't want to bury it, if you don't want to take it west, then what is your plan? Isn't it clear what should happen? Winona asked. All nations have a part to play in this prophecy. For generations, the 7 council fires have guarded it. For generations, your people have searched the globe for it until you unearthed it. For generations, the Chippewa have pressed west searching for it. We can't give it to the Chippewa. They are currently allies with Eos, Lesueur insisted. I agree with you. This white egg is evil, and thus will not let my husband, White Raven, take it back to infect my children with its darkness. There is only one nation who is enemy of all. Lesueur scoffed. The fox? Winona had been a slave of the Meskwaki when Lesueur freed her. By putting it into the hands of the Meskwaki, we will be putting our trust and faith in the hands of the Great Spirit. The last appearance of the Serpent Star signaled the end of an era for my people, who will no longer guard over this evil spirit. Lesueur pondered her plan for a few minutes. And you think another Wishwe will come? When the Serpent Star returns, the Great Spirit will summon another Wishwe to do his will. We must trust in his plans. My enemies know where I found it here, Lesueur insisted. They will destroy the fox, Chippewa, and Sioux to find it. Then they must continue to believe you have it. You will pack it up in the eyes of many. You will load it onto your barges. You will take it personally down the Mississippi River. You will load it onto your ships in front of your enemies, and then, in the eyes of all, you will cast it into the Atlantic Ocean. Lesueur shook his hands. But all the while, it will be in the hands of the Meskwaki. Will you return? Winona had asked. Lesueur shook his head slowly. These people will most likely kill me when they learn the truth. But if I can give you time to raise your children in a world free of evil. Then it will be worth whatever happens to me. Is my bear man still alive? Winona now wondered, staring up at the stars. At the foot of the butte, her sons would soon raise a generation. How much time has he given us? Somewhere in the cosmos, hidden behind the bright stars, the serpent star slithered into its dark hole, destined to return again. But what form will the wish we take? Will my grandchildren and great-grandchildren recognize him? Chapter 102, near Fort Detroit, 1712. A storm answered the prayers of Chief Bequinus. It rolled in from the north, bringing billowing thunderheads and fierce lightning from Lake Huron. Although a foreigner to the region known as Michigan, Bequinus knew his Chippewa forefathers had once inhabited the place they called Wawingagama, but was now known by the French as Detroit, or the Straits. Although an old man well over 60, Bequinus had gathered his most loyal warriors from distant Madeline Island to retrace the steps his people had taken on the Seven Fires migration. Thank you, Great Spirit, for calling your Thunderbird to my aid. Your will be done. For almost 3 weeks, Chief Bequinus and his band of 50 warriors waited on the large island at the mouth of the Detroit River, where Round Lake drained into Lake Erie. The thunder of gunfire and cannon to the south came from several hundred warriors from the Ottawa and Potawatomi, who fought alongside the French in a great battle against the Meskwaki tribe just 5 miles away. Weeyipisu, his eldest son, entered the shelter. His face was painted black, a sign he wanted to join in the slaughter of their enemies. The Fox are finished. If we joined our forces with the Anishinaabe brothers, we could rout them. It is not my destiny to share glory with lesser men, Bequinus muttered. I must trust the path set before me. If the Fox are defeated tonight, Weeyipisu pressed, the glory will go to the unfaithful. Where will that leave us? Perhaps we are suffering dark times to be tested, Bequinus countered. My faith has been rewarded. By returning to the third stopping place, we will find what has been lost. The sacred shell? Weeyipisu asked. So my obstinate son does listen to me. No. Do you know why the Meskwaki went to war against the French? The Red Earthers are inbred fools, Weeyipisu scoffed. Bequinus knew better than his son. The Meskwaki were not only fierce warriors, but also were iron-willed men when motivated. 2 months ago, Chief Lamia and Chief Pimusa brought a great force to Fort Detroit to lay siege to the new fort and cast out the foreigners. Something emboldened them. Something gave them confidence that they could produce a miracle. And I suspect what they possess. They might be fools, but they are also deeply religious, Chief Bequinus countered. Before you were born, when I was still a young man, a strange star appeared in the sky. The Meskwaki saw it as a sign to return to their homelands. Our people refused to listen to me and instead chose to listen to the French traders. The faith of the Meskwaki was rewarded, though, and rumor reached my ear that the star delivered to them a sacred treasure from the days of the dawn, the original water drum. From the story of the 7 grandfathers? The story of how the old man used it to heal the boy on the brink of death. Weeyipisu remembers the stories I told him. The story I told you explained how the old man created the Medewiwin Lodge to honor the Creator. His faith in creating the lodge and the water drum did indeed save the boy's life, but he did not create the original water drum. He only honored what was used to create physical and spiritual life. Are you saying the Fox found the original water drum? Weeyipisu asked with wonder. It gave them confidence to overthrow the French. but it is not the destiny of the Meskwaki to use the water drum in the era of the seventh fire. That right belongs to the Wijigan clan, Uiapisu finished. For generations, since the time when the Anishinaabe dwelt among the great water known as the Atlantic, the Wijigan clan served the prophecy given to the boy hero, Ayash, who was visited by several prophets after a visit to a remote island. His faith led the people from the coast to the city of Montreal. Bakinis meant to keep the faith of his forefathers. I believe the prophets that visited our ancestors generations ago wanted us to find the water drum, so that in the era of the seventh fire, we can help restore the world to what it was meant to be. Our people might have found the seventh stopping place to the west, but it won't matter if we don't have the tools needed to save humanity. I've prayed for most of my life for answers, and in my darkest hour, I discovered that I needed to retrace the path we took. It was never our destiny to defeat the Sioux in open war, and my faith meant leaving our friends and family. But here, at the third stopping place, the great Creator is about to reward my trust. How did the fox end up with our water drum? Bakinis shook his head. It never belonged to us. The current water drums of the Medawiwan are made of deer hide, wood, tobacco, hoop, hair, and stone. But the original water drum was most likely formed by Manabozho himself when the god walked in the form of a man upon the earth. It was not crafted by human hand. The Sioux described it as a white egg. And eggs are symbols of creation, Uiapisu added. Perhaps he will make a great Wijigan priest after all. The prophecies describe a young boy who led the people to the proper path. I will put my trust in the Great Spirit and in you. You honor me, Father. What do you want me to do? Shortly after the Meskwaki began their siege of Fort Detroit, an alliance of Ottawa and Potawatomi came to the aid of the local Huron and Bethune, who had been granted the area in 1701 Treaty of Montreal. Chief Bakinis and his Wijigan warriors also arrived, but remained hidden upon the island several miles from the fighting. Now they would end the fight. After 19 days of fighting, the Meskwaki will use the cover of the storm to flee. Their only path to escape is north, where we will be waiting in ambush. Uiapisu nodded obediently, but his eyes filled with worry. What do I do if I find the water drum? The Creator determines for you to have it. Then we will return west and defeat the Sioux together. Chapter 103, Bermuda, 1712. Louis Armand Guerin stood upon the deck of a German ship, legally owned by the Netherlands, commissioned by the Italian-based Periphery, and currently flying Spanish flags. The Nord de Frevzo, the reinforcer, standing upon his new ship, Guerin indeed felt reinforced for the first time in more than 2 decades. He didn't know the new crew, but he knew where they had come from. With Bermuda buttoned up and ready for an unexpected invasion, the 2 small fleets took their time off the coast of the island. I have enough firepower to claim this island for myself, he decided as he took measure of the Sylphs, as well as the 10 new warships. Am I making a mistake by not attacking? Beside him were Murray and Duke, both now familiar with the new crew after spending months with them while the White Zombie hid in Canada. Drake Murray now captained a ship he dubbed the Son of the Sea, a reference to a Celtic god. Jimmy Duke captained another warship he dubbed the Mary Dyer, a reference to a relative who'd been hanged in Boston. Climbing aboard, Benjamin Horn and the last of his original gunners followed the large wooden crate as it was lifted onto the deck. Unlike the rest of the smaller, more agile warships of the fleet, the Reinforcer was a 300-ton cargo ship, which now took on the cargo of an emptied vault. The Ark of the Covenant, or one of the Arks, is going home. Who truly knows? None of them were foolish enough to directly touch it or open it, a task left for Horn and the Ethiopian priests. 50 yards away, Pierre Charles Lesueur stood with crossed arms on the captain's deck of the White Zombie. Beside him, Professor Farrow, having been told of his part in the impending Mississippi River expedition, nervously paced. The rest of the old crew, Dr. Barrow, Narrowbond, Papa Bones, Manuel del Toro, and Giovanni Naufragio, also stood at the White Zombie's railing, waiting for the transport skiffs to return. They'd all wait back on Tortuga, and upon Garen's return, they'd begin the final mission to the upper Mississippi River. Murray barked out orders for securing the cargo, and soon Duke gave his orders also. They were staying with Garen. Several thousand miles of Atlantic Ocean remained until they reached the tip of Africa, followed by another 4,000 miles past the scene of the crime in Madagascar. Will Rahena still be there? When the anchor came up and the ships began to drift, Garen gave a hearty wave to the White Zombie. In turn, the crew affectionately dropped their drawers, slapping their cheeks as they mooned their former captain. Lesueur saluted with a smirk. Will I ever see them again?